Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined-up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry, plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all kinds of creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly, and it's episode 109, with a cracker of an interview today with Will Dean, creator of the excellent Tuva Moodysson crime series set amongst the dark pines of a Swedish forest community. Really enjoyed my chat with Will, and we talked about everything from writing a fast first draft to what to do when a bull elk turns up in your backyard. You know, as they do. Yet again, the briefest of catch-ups from me before we get started. Hands up who hasn't done any writing since the last podcast. This is radio, so I could lie and say both my hands are by my side, but I'm too honest, and I've got to confess that I haven't done a damn thing since my last intro recording. My day job, video production for new listeners, has taken me all over the UK and even over to Barcelona for a few days, and I've got more travelling to do this week, filming in Nottingham, Brighton and Wimbledon, all of which might sound glamorous, I don't know, depends what your job is, but with multiple projects and hours spent in the car or in front of the edit suite, there's been little to no room in my head for creative stuff, so the technical term is being too knackered to write. But what I have managed to do is just consume lots of stuff, so lots of brilliant TV and books in the run-up to my holiday, so I'm viewing all of this stuff and just kind of thinking about it as filling the creative well, preparing myself to get things back on track over the next couple of weeks. If you're interested in what I've been watching and reading, books-wise, I've been flitting between the excellent Don Winslow novel The Cartel and Adam McKay's hilarious and moving This Is Gonna Hurt, or This Is Going to Hurt, which is based on his diaries from the time he spent as a junior doctor. I highly recommend both of those. TV-wise, I've just finished the latest season of Billions, which is just superb writing, not to mention the incredibly powerful Chernobyl, which should be part of the school curriculum as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, you're probably reading between the lines and thinking, oh, so you've had enough time to watch TV and read, but you're just too lazy to write. Hey, get off my back. Anyway, the good news is in listening back to today's interview with Will, I'm now inspired to get back to my novel ASAP. So let's just get to that right now. So Will Green grew up in the East Midlands, my neck of the woods, before studying law at the LSE and working in London. Eventually, he moved to rural Sweden, built a wooden house in a boggy clearing at the centre of a vast elk forest, as you do, and wrote his successful debut novel Dark Pines. His latest book, Red Snow, is out now from all good bookshops. Okay, well, thanks a million for coming on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So, for a start, why don't we just start off by, well, telling me how things are and give us a sense of where you're actually speaking from.
Okay, it's great to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me. I am talking to you from a clearing in a massive Swedish moose forest, which I call home. So hopefully the internet connection will be okay. It's normally fine, but it can get a bit iffy in the wintertime. So I'm here, I'm looking out at the trees. There's no moose walking by the window right now, but you never know later on. And I've just finished the first draft of the fourth Tuva Moodysson thriller, so I'm feeling normal again. I've been like a zombie for the past month, but now I'm feeling normal again.
Yeah, well, we'll get on to your incredible way that you throw down first drafts a little bit later. But why don't we start, just to start us off, so give us a sense of your latest novel, which was Red Snow, wasn't it, which was book 2. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so Red Snow, yeah, it's the second Tuva Moodysson thriller, so it takes place 4 months after the events of Dark Pines. So Dark Pines is all about the moose hunt, the elk hunt in the Swedish forest in October. Red Snow takes place in February, in the coldest time of the year in Sweden, when temperatures get down to kind of minus 25, minus 30. And the book opens with Tuva driving through this small, creepy town, this isolated kind of Twin Peaksy kind of town. And she notices 5 or 6 people standing around in the middle of Storgatan, the main street in town, looking up at the licorice factory, at the 2 chimneys on top of this massive Gothic licorice factory. And Tuva knows that when it's minus 25, people don't stand around on the street looking up.
Yeah.
So she's kind of intrigued. She steps out of her pickup truck and she sees a figure climbing one of the chimneys. And he's wearing a suit, and he gets to the top of the chimney and he throws himself off to his death. And Tuva Moodyson has to work out, was that a suicide or was it in fact a murder?
Brilliant. So it's a great kicking off point then.
I hope so. It was fun to write. That's my main thing. Like, I figure if I'm not having fun, if I'm not getting a buzz writing it, at least in the first draft, by the time it gets to draft 20, it's just really hard work. But if I'm not getting a kick out of it in draft 1, then I don't think the readers will either. So that opening was fun to write. The whole book was really fun to write. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it sounds great. So you mentioned there Tuva Moodyson, your protagonist that you've got in your series. So tell us a little bit about how you came up with Tuva, and give us a bit more of a sense of who Tuva is.
So Tuva is, thank God I came up with Tuva. I have no idea how it happened. She kind of came to me like in a thunderbolt, in like fully formed. It was really odd. I'm quite a visual writer, so I was visualizing this huge, overgrown, dark spruce forest in my mind's eye, and I zoomed in and I saw a gravel track snaking through the trees, and I zoomed in some more and I saw this pickup truck, and I looked through the window kind of in my mind's eye, and I saw a woman driving the pickup truck, and she had blonde hair and hearing aids. So Tuva came to me very clearly like that. She was a young, deaf, ambitious Swedish journalist, and she hates nature. She's terrified of the great outdoors. And I feel kind of guilty sometimes because I put her in this really awful place where there's a lot of bears and wolves and elk. So,
do you feel guilty though? Be honest. You're secretly pleased, aren't you?
I mean, sometimes I do, because I spend all my year writing these books. I put a lot of time into these books, and I'm writing from her perspective the whole time. So I kind of looking at the world through her eyes, and sometimes I do feel bad for her. But at the same time, I think you need that to have that kind of underlying tension in a thriller. So
definitely. Well, I think with anything, you put them into those difficult situations, and obviously, hopefully, it's thrilling and interesting for the reader to watch them try and extricate themselves from those situations, isn't it?
Exactly. It's fun. It's fun. We're here to have fun.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about the particular part of Sweden that. Well, I'm guessing the particular part of Sweden that you write about is that pretty much the same area that you live in now yourself?
It's like 3 hours or 4 hours north of where I live. So where I live is kind of more civilized in a way. Like, the winters don't get quite as cold. We have elk here. We have like eagles flying around over my forest. But up there where Tuva's based, they do have bears. They do have more wolves. We have some wolves, but they have more wolves. They have wolverines up there and lynx cats and things. So it's like an extra degree wilder. There's that kind of threat there. There's that sense of danger and menace more than there is here. So that's, for me, it's thrilling. I go up there once a year in February to do like a weekend research trip. I go up on the train and I just sense it's slightly different there. Like, down here, when I set off on the train, the ground is often green, and then I get up there and there's snow and the lakes are iced over. So it's just a little bit more extreme.
And do you sort of see Sweden, and particularly the area that you write about for your books, do you see that almost as a character in the books?
I love books with a vivid, rich sense of place. I really like immersive stories like that. So I try and write what I love to read. So yeah, I really like Utgard Forest. This forest that surrounds the fictional town of Gavrik in the books is a really bad place. Like it's a horrible place. It's 10 times bigger than my forest, and there's a lot of very weird, eccentric characters living in there. So yeah, I like books where, whether it's a Cormac McCarthy novel and the desert is a main character, or whether it's an Abhiya Mukherjee novel and 1920s India is the backdrop. I love being immersed in a story, so that's absolutely what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, well, it's great. I'm reading Dark Pines at the moment, and you've definitely succeeded from that point of view. It's brilliant. It is really, really evocative, and makes you want to put the heating on when you're reading it as well.
Thank you. That's a big compliment. Thank you.
So yeah, well, let's go back a little bit. So tell me a little bit about your background, because I think you're originally from a similar part of the world to me, or at least roughly. I think you're from the East Midlands originally. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm from the East Midlands. I'm from a little town east of Nottingham. I moved around a lot as a kid, but I was always based in the East Midlands, kind of in the middle of nowhere as well. And then I moved down to London when I was 18 to study law, and I stayed in London for 15 years doing lots of very weird jobs, just trying to kind of make ends meet. And then I came over to Sweden to live in the woods, and I built a wooden house here. That was like 7 years ago.
You make that sound like it's kind of a very natural thing to do, and it seems very obvious. But how did you make that leap from I'm learning law in London to I'm going to go and live in a big clearing in the middle of a Swedish forest?
I think when I was growing up in the Midlands, I loved the great outdoors. I love peace and quiet and reading and writing. But there was a little part of me that craved to get out of the East Midlands and go to London and see what I could do there. And when I was in London in my 20s, I was working hard, doing very, some like proper jobs and some weird jobs. And I loved London for a while in my 20s. But then when I got to my 30s, I was like, my wife is Swedish. I should say that. That makes more sense that we moved here then.
That makes, that's making a bit more sense now, yeah.
Yeah, but we lived in a one-bedroom flat in Earls Court, like a tiny little flat. And we were like, we're never going to be able to afford a balcony or a two-bedroom flat, never mind like somewhere I can grow some food. And I craved that kind of just back to basics life style. So my wife is very understanding, thank goodness, and she was like, well, I had this idea of moving to the woods, and we had a deal together, like if she was terrified after 6 months, if she didn't enjoy it, we would just sell and move to a town. And luckily she really likes it, and 7 years later we're still here.
No, that's great. So when did the writing stuff start? Is that something that you did when you were younger? What's your earliest memories of writing, would you say?
I was definitely writing a lot as a little kid. I was a very weird, awkward kid, kind of in my own bubble. I didn't have many friends. I was very much into nature and stories. So I was reading and rereading a lot, and I got a lot of comfort from that, especially Roald Dahl, and later on like Adrian Mole, and later on like Trainspotting and Thomas Harris. And I was just very much obsessed, like into my own imagination. That was my world. And I wasn't writing after that. Like in my teens and my 20s, I definitely didn't have the confidence to be a writer or to start writing. I was obsessed with reading, so I was always reading, but it never occurred to me that I could be a writer. I think that's partly because of my background. I come from a very practical family where, people are painters and decorators, that kind of thing. And I never expected to be able to be a writer. So it took me until I was in my mid-30s to have the confidence to say, actually, I'm going to write something. Like, I'm going to give this a crack. And when I was doing my job in London, I used to go to W.H. Smith at Liverpool Street Station every Friday for about a year or two. And I used to look at the pads and the papers in my lunch hour. And I used to say to myself, the day you quit your job and you go to Sweden, you live in the woods, then you can buy one pad and one pen and go and write your book. And that kind of kept me going, the fact that I wasn't allowed to do it until I was ready, until I'd built the house, which I did when I was still working full time on weekends, flying over with Ryanair on those £5 and £10 tickets they used to have back then. And then the last day when I quit my job, I bought the pad and I bought the pen, and then I wrote a book.
As you do. So you treated yourself to a refill pad and a pen.
that's all it was. Honestly, I think if I ever have anything fancy, I'll jinx the whole thing. So even now, I've got a 5-book publishing deal. I've got, you know, a TV contract, but I work at an old battered IKEA dining table. My laptop's a Compaq, which is from 2011, and the battery doesn't work, so it has to be plugged in all the time. It doesn't connect to the internet. And I've got this weird thing, like if I get a fancy laptop or I get like a fancy pen, then there's a little voice in the back of my head, like, who do you think you are, kind of thing. So I like to keep it basic.
Yeah, well, if it's not broke, then don't try to fix it, sort of thing.
Yeah. I'd rather just focus on the stories.
So when you first started to actually get back into writing then as an adult, what were the first sorts of things you started to write? Was it immediately crime? Were they short stories? Or did you think, right, I'm going to sit down and go try and write a book straight away? How did that pan out?
So with that pad and that pen, I sat down and wrote a really terrible book, like a real stinker. Like a completely flawed first novel, which is now locked in a drawer and will remain so forever. And it was like, I don't even know what it was, man. To be honest, I can't even describe it. It was so ugly and so terrible. It was like some kind of thriller, but it wasn't really a thriller. They had 7 main characters, 7 point of views, based in 7 countries over 2 years. It was a big mess. And I spent years, like maybe 2 or 3 years, rewriting that book, rewriting it, tearing it down from 90,000 words down to 30,000, back up again, ripping out subplots, changing characters. And by the end of that process, I got it so it was as good as it could ever be, but it was never going to be a good book. And I was submitting to agents over and over again for years, and they were starting to bite. Like, I was starting to get full requests for that book. And then I withdrew it because I was like, this is not a good book. Like, there's a chance this might sneak through and get me an agent, but it's not going to be my debut novel. It's not good enough. So I withdrew it. And then I sat down and wrote Dark Pines. And I wrote that really fast, and it felt a lot more natural and a lot more kind of clean and simple. It's a very, very simple book. It's one person's point of view, set in one small town over 2 weeks. So it's like the opposite of that terrible book. Yeah,
but, that's a story that I hear like over and over and over again, and it's the same for me. You know, I think for a lot of people, it's that first one is almost like proving that you can do it, and it's kind of what comes out. And you do learn so much, don't you, through the process?
Absolutely. I really learned a lot. Especially I learned the fact that I didn't want that to be my book. And I learned the fact that I need to be less ambitious and focus on a smaller thing and make it as good as I can make it. So I definitely learned a lot through that process. And to be honest, if it had taken me 5 or 6 books to get to the book I was happy with that could get me a deal, then I would have just hung in there for 5 or 6 books. You know, it takes as long as it takes. And I often say this, you know, I'm doing these little YouTube videos to try and...
Yeah, they're great.
Thank you. I'm just started out just like a couple of months ago, and I just want to kind of help writers who are in a situation where I was a few years ago, where it's difficult. Like it can feel like the odds are stacked against you so much. And that's how I felt, you know, when the rejections are coming through every day. So I try to keep saying in those videos, there's no set path. Like there's no set timeline. There's no set path. It's not like if you're studying to be a teacher or you're working towards being a doctor, then there's a path for you. You know, there's a certain number of stages and hoops you have to go through. But if you're a writer, if you're anything artistic, it can go anywhere. You know, it's going to take as long as it takes. It might take a year, it might take 20 years, and you just kind of got to go with the flow, and you'll get there eventually.
Yeah, that's great advice. And in terms of like the craft and learning it, was it something that it was kind of organic and you learnt a lot from writing and rewriting that first bad novel, as you called it, or did you read books, or how did you sort of pick up the elements of craft, or was it very much a natural process for you?
I think it was mainly through reading books a lot and rereading books. Like I've reread my favorite books, some of them 10 or 15 or 20 times, and you start to understand the structure. You know, your first reading is quite an emotional experience, but then your second, third reading is more of an intellectual experience. You start picking it apart and working out how the author wrote it. So most of it is through reading, but I haven't done any writing courses. I haven't read many or any like how to write a novel book, but I did read On Writing by Stephen King over and over again. Yeah, when I was in London, and I love that book so much. I really recommend it.
So do I. It's brilliant.
Isn't it? It's so good, isn't it?
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, and it's one of those books, it seems to come up like every every couple of shows it comes up, and it's the same thing. It's like everybody. I think it's one of those books. I think. I mean, I've recommended it to non-writing friends because I suggest. I know you're not into writing, but honestly, just as a creative and like as an inspiring thing to make you look differently at creativity, and I think just like following something that you're interested in and following it with a passion. I just think it was really, really inspiring. Plus, like all of Stephen King's or most of Stephen King's stuff. Obviously, he's a great storyteller, so the way that he weaves it into his life, and he also obviously uses his traumatic experience that he had with when he got ran over and all that kind of stuff. It's just brilliantly put together.
I totally agree, and I'm going to steal your idea and start recommending it to non-writer friends. That's a really good idea, because I think you're right. Like, the thing I love about that book, so many things. It's very, very generous the way he just opens up and tells us exactly how he's done things, but it's not a prescriptive kind of how to write book. It's more like how to be a writer, or how to feel like a writer, how to think like a writer. It's just, I love that book because it gives me confidence every time I reread it. And that's really half the battle, is having that confidence. Like, I don't need somebody to tell me whether I should use adverbs or not use adverbs. I'm going to work that out on my own. But I do need that bit of confidence, because writing novels is terrifying.
It is, yeah, I agree. Well, it's literally, I mean, in your case, it's literally going off into the woods, but it's also metaphorically going off into the woods, isn't it, every time you sit down to write?
It really is. I April the 1st, so like a month and a half ago, I started to write Tuva 4, the fourth one. And the fact that I've written novels before doesn't give me that much extra confidence. It's still terrifying. It might even be more terrifying than before. And the first week, I'm buzzing, I'm excited because it's a new idea and I'm getting into the story, I'm finding my way. But at the same time, I'm terrified because it could go off the rails, it could go nowhere, it could hit a dead end. I could lose all confidence. Like, for me, it's like a confidence trick. That's why I write my first drafts in 4 weeks, because I am terrified. So if I can keep that momentum up and I can write like every day 2 or even 3 chapters, then, and I'm not looking back and I'm not overthinking things, then I know I'll get the book finished in a month, that rough first draft. So it's all like, my main motivation is just not being terrified.
Well, let's just discuss that 4 weeks thing, because I noticed that I know that when in researching for this, I saw like a couple of previous interviews that you'd done online with written interviews, and I'd seen the thing about the 4 week first drafts, and both times it sort of seemed to just get passed over by the person interviewing you, and I was like, wait a minute, 4 weeks. And I know that that's a first draft, as you say, and there's lots and lots and lots of rewriting, and you probably spend another 10 or 11 months or whatever rewriting it. But still, still pretty impressive to throw down a first draft in 4 weeks. So, how does that work? Do you do a lot of outlining and stuff before? How does that work?
So the first time this happened was with Dark Pines, and I had no idea I was going to write the first draft in 4 weeks. I had no idea. I just knew that I was on parental leave at the time, so I was looking after my little boy, who was 1.5 at the time. No, he's 1, like 1.25, and he had 2 naps a day, 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. And he was a good napper, thank God. And I knew I could write in the morning and write in the afternoon in those naps. So I ended up writing a chapter in the morning, and 1 in the afternoon. And I thought that first draft would take me 6 months-ish, and it took me 4 weeks, just because I was using his nap times. I'm writing 7 days a week. And I got this buzz. I got this energy from it, this kind of momentum. Lee Child talks about this as well, the fact that a story needs vitality, it needs life. And I really agree with that. I love writing that first draft fast, because I'm working out the story. I'm finding my way through the story. I'm racing through. I'm getting to know these characters. And I don't know, if I stopped and looked back, I think I would just think this is terrible and lose all confidence. But I love forging ahead like that. But it does come at a price. Like, I'm absolutely exhausted at the end of that month. And during those 4 weeks, I am a complete zombie. Like, I can do what I need to do. I pick my boy up from his school. I do the dishes. I do the stuff I need to do. But emotionally, I'm spent. And in my head, I stay in Tuva's head pretty much the whole month. So when it comes to an end, I'm absolutely knackered.
Yeah, understandably so. And do you find that you tend to go? Do you tend to go off down lots of narratively speaking, do you go off down like lots of dead ends, or do you tie yourself up with lots of plot difficulties? Obviously, there's stuff that you've got to sort out in the edit, but how do you approach that? Do you just keep going, and do you have lots of false starts within that first draft, or is it pretty much?
I don't know. I don't, to be honest with you. That's partly because the stories are simple. I think if you write a story in a very simple way, like my stories are told chronologically, and they take place over between 1 and 2 weeks in this small town from one person's point of view, there's nowhere to hide. Like if I was writing a complicated plot from 2 or 3 different points of view, different points in history, flashbacks and all of that kind of thing, it's a lot more complicated. But my books are straightforward, and I think that's quite refreshing to write it that way. And there is nowhere to hide, like Tuesday follows Monday in my books. But what I do is before I start writing, after that train journey that I told you about, I start visualizing. That's the key for me. I'm not one of these writers who has this massive plot written on the wall in a chart form with lots of different colored post-it notes. I think that's great for some writers, but I don't want to know exactly what happens in every single chapter, but I do want to know the key scenes and the general vibe and the atmosphere of the book. And I want to get to know my main characters. So what I do is I visualize a lot. So I close my eyes and I daydream, basically. That's my job now. And I do that especially before I go to bed at night. I spend a good bit of time in the weeks before I start a first draft thinking through the first few chapters, what happens at the end of Act 1, what happens in the middle of the book. So I don't have everything, but I can see the whole story unfold inside my eyelids before I start writing on the 1st of April.
And do you tend to make notes and stuff like that? Do you put these kind of key tentpole moments, or whatever you want to call them, down on paper?
I do, yeah. Yeah, so I do, yeah. So I don't make a huge amount of notes, but I have like a little bit of a sketch of the face of each main character in each book, and just a few, like, it's not really, I don't really understand the characters that well before the first draft or during the first draft, but I know how they're connected. And for me, that's kind of the most important thing, where the relationships are, where the secrets are, where the lies and the grudges and the secret love affairs are. I want to know all that stuff. But I don't want to make too many notes. Like, I understand the big event at the end of Act 1, at the end of Act 2. I understand the ending of the book better than any other part of the book before I start. Like, I know what I'm working towards, but I don't want to know every single detail. And even at the end of the first draft, it takes me those 9-10 months of rewriting to understand the characters. I want to know the motivation of every single character, no matter how small, no matter how minor their role. And it takes me those months to figure all that out and to layer up the characters and the atmosphere. So I don't know. If you look at it in terms of the hours spent writing, I might spend 3 times as long as another writer who puts out a book every 3 years, because I put so many hours in per week. I just have to do that because it takes me that long to figure out all the secrets of these small communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So did you ever try to write short stories or anything before, or was it just straight in with that first bad book, as you called it?
I went straight in with a novel because that's what I always read. I read short stories, but not that many. Like 90%, 95% of my reading is novels. So that felt natural to me. That length felt natural. And since I wrote Dark Pines, I haven't written a short story. I've got a couple of ideas for them because I really like creepy short stories. I think they can be much creepier and more unnerving than full-length novels. So maybe I'll write a short story at some point. But I love novels. I love that form.
Yeah, you just like writing in that. So you talked about, in terms of your journey to publication, so when you decided to, pull that first book back in and think, right, this is going to be my debut, this next book is going to be my debut, this is what I'm going to put out. So talk to me a little bit about your querying process and the rejection and all that kind of stuff. How did that pan out? How long did it take from when you started submitting the novel to when you actually got picked up?
It didn't take that long, actually. With the Terrible book before, I submitted that in waves over a few years. And that I just felt that was really torturous. That was really painful. Like getting rejected for years on end. It's kind of like a rite of passage. We all have to go through that, but it's tough. So with Dark Pines, I had a different feeling in my gut. Like with the Bad Book, I took that to the Festival of Writing in York and I pitched it to some agents. And I was doing a lot of hard work pitching it. I was really, really trying to sell this Bad Book and doing a lot of prep on those pitches. And then I took Dark Pines as well, that the last time. And I just kind of sat back and the book spoke for itself, if that makes sense. Like obviously I was making an effort, but there was no need to sell it because I had confidence in it. I was like, an agent eventually will want this, and it's up to me and the agent to work out how that relationship's going to work. Do you know what I mean? So I wasn't terrified of that whole process anymore because I knew I had something that was maybe not valuable, but something decent at last after that stinking, awful first book. So I did have a little bit of confidence. I didn't know how long it would take. So what I did was I submitted Dark Pines to 20 agents off the bat. And I did that because I was so fed up with the book before and all those rejections. So I submitted to 20, and within a couple of weeks, I got an offer. I got the first full request, and then I got some more full requests, and in the end, I got 10 full requests out of 20, and which is like
it's a good hit,
a lot better odds than with the first book. And then the first agent to request a full offered representation. And so that was amazing. That was like a life-changing moment. I still remember it. It's a very, very emotional moment after all those rejections. And then I started getting more offers coming in. So I had like multiple offers. I think I had 3 or 4. I had 3 firm offers and 2 who couldn't get back to me in the deadline because I had to set a deadline. Like, you know, you've got 3 days if you want to offer representation, which was I was not comfortable setting that deadline at all. Because it felt very alien to me, but one of the agents wanted that, so I went along with it. So I had like 3 firm offers and 2 who ran out of time because they weren't in the UK at the time. And the 3 who offered, I flew over to meet with them. And like one took me out for lunch, one took me out for drinks, one took me out for dinner, and I had that really strange feeling that I never expected to be able to choose which agent I would work with, and then all of a sudden. I was like, I felt a huge amount of pressure to make the right decision because I was going to work with this person maybe for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So that was also terrifying. And I was very anxious about making that decision. All 3 agents were superb. Like they were 3 of the agents I really wanted to work with. So that was a really, really tough call. But I went with the first agent who actually requested the full and who offered representation. And she's been absolutely brilliant, and I love working with her.
And what do you think it was in that? I mean, obviously, there is the fact that they were the first to come back. I know that's a psychological thing in itself. But obviously, when you met with them, what do you think it was that made you choose the agent? I mean, you give her a shout out. You may as well. Who is it, and what was it that made it click for you?
So my agent is Kate Burke, and she's at Blake Friedman, and all of those agents had different strengths. Like they were all fantastic in different ways. And it was a really, really tough choice. But I just love the fact that Kate had it all. So I could see she was a good deal maker. She had sold books recently before then at auction, you know, that had done really well. She represented authors that I really respected and really admired. And I liked their writing. She had a lot of editorial experience. So she'd worked for, I think, 10 years at 3 different big 5 publishing houses on the editorial side. So I knew she understood publishing. I knew she was really well connected. I knew she could do deals, and I knew she represented writers who I really admired. So for me, that was like a full house. And then when I met with her, instead of like having a business meeting, we had a lunch, and we basically talked about Stephen King for 2 hours. And I like that. It was just fun. It was enjoyable. Like she's the kind of person, the kind of agent where I'm happy to sit next to her on a plane or on a train on the way to something, because we have similar taste in books on some things. And she's just like, she's passionate about storytellers.
And I suppose it's like anything. You just you sort of connected on a personal level as well as a professional level.
I did, yeah, and unfortunately, I connected with the other two as well, which made it really, really genuinely difficult. Like I would have been lucky to sign with any of those three agents. Absolutely,
Hmm.
really lucky and really happy to. So it was a tough call. It was a really tough call. And the other agents were great. They were so lovely. Like when I called them the next day from Heathrow and my kind of hands were shaking, flying
Hmm.
back to the forest, and I told them that I was signing with Kate, and they were both like, great decision, gutted, but totally understand this is the way things work, and we will be championing your book, from the sidelines and buying it and whatever. So they were awesome and
Hmm.
really, really kind. And that's my experience of publishing as a whole, actually, is that everybody looks after each other and everybody supports each other, especially in the crime world. But I think in publishing in general, people seem to be very, very nice. I think maybe they're very empathetic because they read a lot. I don't know, but it's the nicest kind of industry that I've ever worked in.
I agree. I mean, from my experience, speaking to everyone, I've obviously been doing this podcast for about 5 years, and I would agree. There does seem to be it's one of those things. It's again when you from the outside looking in. Sometimes with any kind of industry, you assume it's going to be very very cliquey and competitive, and obviously there is an air of competitive a nature to it in some respects with the big publishers and all that kind of thing. But yeah, in general, I think writers support writers, and as you say, agents know how it works, and everybody just wants to see more great writing and great books out in the world. I think.
That's exactly it. And all the agents out there, all the editors out there, all the publicists out there, they're all big readers. They all enjoy reading books, whatever genre. So it's quite nice. We all connect on that kind of level.
So so obviously you bash out this, amazingly fast, intense first draft. So tell me a little bit about the rewriting process for you. Where do you start? So you've written that first draft, do you give it some time to sit and settle before you go back to it? And kind of have you got an order in which you approach things?
Yeah, I do. I let it rest. I think that's a really important part of the whole thing. I need some distance from it, and I'm knackered as well. I'm exhausted, so I let it rest for about 2 months normally, and I often do a lot of events then. So end of April I finished Tuva 4. Then just now I've been doing events in Newcastle and in Bristol and all over the place. So now it's kind of nice because I'm not thinking about that book right now, and then I will read it probably the end of June, the end of next month, and I'll come to it with fresh eyes. Like I won't remember half the stuff I wrote in that book because I was such a zombie in such a trance. And I quite like that.
Hmm.
So what I want is like the ideal thing for me is to read that first draft and get a kick out of it. You know?
Yeah.
Like I'm not going to get as big a kick out of it as if I'm reading a new Stephen King novel or a new Sarah Waters novel, but I'm going to get I want my little face to light up at certain points. Like if I've written something that's genuinely creepy and unsettling, or some funny quip from Tuva, I want to have a reaction to that. And then I have this kind of sense of foreboding of the amount of work I've got to do because a lot of it will need rewriting so many times. But that's part of the game, I know how much work is involved now, and I'm not afraid of that. I'm lucky to be able to do this full time. So if I didn't do it full time, I don't know how long it would take me to write each book, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. And do you tend in terms of like word counts and things, is the first draft long? Do you do a lot of cutting or is it predominantly rewriting?
I think the first three Tuva books, the first drafts were just under 100,000. This one's just under 90,000. And then they maybe add 5 or 10,000 in the rewrites, 10,000 words.
Hmm.
Um, it's strange. If you were to do a side by side comparison, my first draft to my finished published novel, obviously there's a lot of spelling mistakes in the first draft and a lot of like names that change mysteriously halfway through, where Sandra becomes
I do
John
that
and stuff.
too,
Yeah, that's fine. But
yeah.
but the book's there. Like every chapter is the same in the first draft and the last draft. Every chapter is structured in the same way. The same things happen. It's the same cliffhanger ending of each chapter. The same twists are there. The same ending. The same atmosphere, the same dialogue, the same characters. All of that is there in the first draft. But what has to come through those really arduous rewrites is that sense of small community, that kind of Twin Peaks, True Detective Series 1, Fargo vibe. And that takes me a lot of rewrites to understand all of those secrets and really kind of penetrate that community. I need to keep rewriting it to get to that point where it makes sense, and the kind of spider web that bonds the community together is evident to the reader. So that's what that's what I need from the rewrites. The characters develop a little bit more, and I understand the motivation driving each character. And at the end point, so at the beginning, that first draft, the story is there, but a lot of the mechanics of the plot aren't there. The reveals aren't clear, the clues aren't satisfying enough, the ending doesn't make enough sense. So at the end, all of that hopefully knits together better.
What would you say in general across the whole of your writing career so far? What would you say has been the biggest challenge or roadblock you've faced along the way? And tell me how you overcame it.
It's a good question. For me, the biggest challenge always is the confidence issue. It's the sense of terror that I have when I think that I need to write 100,000 words. It needs to be an original story. It needs to be worthy of the money and the time that readers are going to invest in it. It needs to stand up against a Netflix series, never mind other books. So I have that kind of sense of, I need to do this justice. I need to do Tuva justice. This book needs to be really satisfying. It needs to be really exciting. I want to deliver the best possible book I can. So that's what terrifies me, and that's the biggest challenge. It's not like there's no practical thing that worries me, like a particular copy edit or a particular part of the process. I feel very lucky now that I've got over those hurdles, of getting an agent, which is a massive hurdle. It took me years to get over, and getting a publishing deal. Now I'm in that point where I'm lucky. I'm in the system, but I feel this huge pressure that every book needs to be better than the book before. And that's a big challenge and a big weight on my shoulders. I do not want to be complacent about this. I feel very, very lucky to be, from the East Midlands, now living in the forest in Sweden, writing books. It's the dream come true. I need to improve. I need to keep reading great writers. I need to up my reading if possible. I need to kind of screen out all the noise and just focus on my craft and get better. And I need to keep giving myself that buzz, that kick. I really, really, really need to emphasize this. It's really important to give yourself as a writer that sense of fun. Like, a lot of the process is really, really difficult and it's just hard work. But somewhere along the line, you need that sense of fun, that sense of glee, that sense of childlike, like tapping into imagination, tapping into a new story. And so I'm terrified, but I'm also having the time of my life.
Yeah, it's the classic, it's the classic cliche. Man grows up in East Midlands, moves to the middle of a forest in Sweden. I mean, you've heard it so many times.
Maybe you're going to join me in a few years' time. Who knows?
It does sound tempting. It definitely does sound tempting.
Land is very cheap out here. No Swedes want to live in the woods anymore. They remember the horror stories.
Move into the city.
Yeah, exactly. They remember the horror stories from their grandparents' age, where it was so tough. There was no broadband, obviously. There was no like 4-wheel drive. And now it's a lot easier. Like it's still tough, obviously, in winter here. If our well breaks down or something, or there's one big bull elk wandering through the garden, it's tough, but it's a lot easier than it used to be.
How do you deal with that? Just the latter, just as in case there's anybody listening that needs that kind of practical advice.
How do you deal with it?
Just go indoors until he's gone.
Well, you know what? I'm absolutely transfixed every time I see a moose. Or an elk.
I'm not
it's
surprised.
like being on safari. I can't believe it, how big they are, how wild they are. The first time a big bull was in the garden and wouldn't go, I went out with a saucepan or 2 saucepans, and I made myself as big as possible, and I put the saucepans above my head and I smashed them together. And he kind of just looked up slowly at me. Like, who is this English loser trying to scare me? I'm not scared. I'm staying exactly where I am. So I went inside, with my tail between my legs. And yeah, they're just awe-inspiring.
He went in his own time.
Yeah, he really did. I think he was there for a few days. And we had another one we had a hammock between 2 birch trees. And he got his antlers stuck in the hammock. And he was thrashing around trying to get free and breaking the hammock, and he got himself tangled up, and we were worried, because he was furious at this point, and he was a big old bull, how we were going to deal with this, because it was becoming like a welfare issue, a welfare question. So we thought we might have to call a hunter to deal with him. But luckily he got loose and kind of wandered off into the forest.
with the hammock.
with
on his
half the
head,
hammock.
presumably.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, just we kind of wrap things up. So, what have you got? You've kind of alluded to it, some of the stuff that you've been working on, but what have you got coming up next? What's next on your plate?
So yeah, Red Snow came out in January in hardback, so it comes out in paperback later on in the year. And I've got Snake River, the third Tuva Moodyson book, coming out next spring. So I'm working on that right now as well with copy edits. And I'm also dealing with Lionsgate, who will hopefully be making a TV series out of the books.
I saw that. That's exciting. So it's been optioned.
Yeah, it's so exciting. I met with the guys in London a few months ago, and we talked about. I basically told them about that vision I had before I started writing Dark Pines of that forest and zooming in and seeing the truck, and then I kind of realized that I ripped off the beginning of The Shining. But that's fine. I mean, if you're going to rip off anything, it might as well be that.
I'm going to say it's a good thing to rip off.
Exactly, but it was really interesting talking to the TV guys, because they see things from a whole different perspective. You know, everything has to be visual, everything has to make sense visually. You can't really get inside Tuva's head; it needs to be demonstrated on the screen and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was fascinating talking to them. It's
And
really a world that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you that. Do you think it'd be something further down the line that you'd like to get more involved with, that side of things?
I'm going to say maybe. The only reason I would say maybe is because Stephen King did it. Which is cool, and I love watching old interviews with Stephen King back from the 80s and the 90s, because it's just fascinating to see him back then. But my gut kind of tells me that I should focus on what I'm doing and get good at it, get better at it, and that's really what I want to do. I'm obsessed with the process. Once a book is finished and it's published, I almost forget about it. It's all about writing the next book and having the next idea and getting better. And, making my words more moving and more impactful, and making the world that I create more immersive. So that's what I want to focus on.
Well, that's great. Well, that's a really good place to finish. So thanks a million, Will. Really appreciate it. Some really useful stuff there, and good luck with the continuing series.
Thank you so much. Real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, thanks again to Will, and be sure to check out the Tuva Moodyson series and Red Snow, which is out right now, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the show downloaded automatically every single episode. Also, remember to get in touch with all your writing news, views, questions or comments, and you can tweet me about that at JU Podcast or at Mr. Kelly to you, and I'll give you a mention in a future show. Look out for the next episode when I'll be chatting to New Zealand-based author Steph Green. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading and watching TV if you're me. Yeah, okay, get off my back. And I'll see you next time.
Joined up, right?